Right. Oh, no, go back. Middle. Oh, I got to get teacher names.
I've got 3 so far that I recognized.
Okay. I saw Trisha. Who else did you see?
Christy Moon.
Christy
and then
Moon.
Elise Weeks.
Okay. Moon, Elise Weeks. Okay. And Trisha. Okay.
All right, as you are coming into the session, if you would go ahead and go to joinpd.com and you'll enter the code that's on the screen. I'm going to leave that up on the screen for a couple more minutes till we get started.
There are teacher friends. Hey, girl. Trisha. Hey, Trisha. Abby.
Trying to get it where my kids can sit because we're all at school together.
Oh, that's a really good idea. How fun.
So, yeah.
I'm glad you're doing that because Danielle and I were just talking about technology and just getting this up and running. You would think it's an act of Congress, dear Lord. And it's supposed to be easy, but
I'm glad it's y'all and not me because I like hit buttons and start freaking out. So
me too. That's what I'm always worried about. That's like after the last one, I was like, oh my God, I don't know what to hit. I'm going to lose everybody. And then I don't know how to get people back. And I'm like, I just want to teach people in person, you know, and teach them in person, or somebody come set it up and then I'll sit down and teach.
All right, guys, we're going to give it about 1 more minute. Like I said, you'll want to go to joinpd.com. It should be in the chat box and you'll enter the code that's on the screen to join the Pear Deck session. Please make sure that you do join the Pear Deck session.
Joinpd.com. OYZLD. Get everybody's names down so I can put them down. I got Christy, I got Maria,
All right,
Abby, and Trisha.
It's 4 o'clock, so we are going to go ahead and get started. Those of you who are still just coming in, please keep in mind the join code will be up in the top right-hand corner of your screen. It's going to be 6 characters. So just make sure that you're entering that because it's really important that you join the Pear Deck session so that you can get the most out of this. I will start off by introducing myself. I'm Ms. Seymour and I am in Mobile, Alabama. I teach at Baker High School and I am joined this evening by Christy Mormon. She teaches at Homewood High School in the Birmingham area. So hopefully between the two of us, we can give you some really good, meaningful feedback about 2 very important topics. So which statement grabs you at the moment? Take a look at each one of these statements and just drag the icon to whichever one you feel like is the best description of where you are right now.
Got a little bit across the board.
Mm-hmm. All right, so it looks like we're kind of all over the place. I do see some of you that are indicating that you're very confident, and that's wonderful, but it looks like most of you are kind of at a place where you're kind of confident or you know what these are, but a little review certainly won't hurt, especially considering these are 2 really important units within the course. So let's go ahead and keep it moving. So in this study session, obviously you can see we're going to be talking about both learning and memory. So we will start off by talking about some learning principles, so classical and operant conditioning, of course, and then we'll also look at the differences between reinforcement and punishment and look at some of those partial and intermittent reinforcement schedules that I know can definitely give people some trouble. From there, we'll move into Unit 5 content, so we'll be looking at the types and processes of memory and then talk about some factors that influence memory. So like I said, we're going to start off with learning. Let's go ahead and take a look at this very first question. 4-year-old Scott fell down the stairs at his grandmother's house. Although he wasn't badly hurt, he was very frightened. Now, whenever his parents mention visiting his grandmother's house, he feels anxious and fearful. In classical conditioning terms, what are the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus in the scenario respectively? All right, I'm seeing a pretty clear kind of winner in these answer choices. It looks like most of you are going directly to letter B, grandmother's house and falling. So if we look at this situation, when Scott falls down the stairs at his grandmother's house, first of all, we know that he wasn't hurt. So it's not a situation where he's associating pain with this experience. But every time he thinks about going to his grandmother's house, he's now associating his grandmother's house with that falling, and it makes him feel anxious and fearful. So the conditioned stimulus, remember, that's the original neutral stimulus. It's something that shouldn't really cause an emotional reaction or really cause any response at all. So here, that conditioned stimulus would be grandmother's house, and then the unconditioned stimulus would be falling. So since we are talking about those terms, let's use probably one of the most famous models of classical conditioning that there is. I like to always tell my students, even people who have never taken a psychology course tend to understand the reference to Pavlov's dogs because it's become sort of a pop culture reference. So when we look at Pavlov's model of conditioning, it's important to remember that he was working with dogs. And when he was working with these dogs, before they were conditioned to do anything, he presented them with dog food, and their response was to salivate, because if somebody puts food in front of you and you're hungry, you're going to salivate. That's a natural animal response. So when I teach this to my students in my classroom, I always emphasize the part of unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response, because you don't have to be taught to do these things. Nobody has to be taught to salivate when food is put in front of them. Okay. Now, before conditioning as well, Pavlov decided he wanted to try to see what else he could get the dogs to salivate to. So he worked with a bell, a light, a whistle. So in this scenario, we see it's a whistle, and the whistle is a neutral stimulus, because when you blow a whistle to a dog, you know, they may look confused or curious, but they're not going to do anything. They're not going to have a response. So we say that the whistle or the bell is that neutral stimulus because it doesn't trigger any response. There's no conditioned response at that point. During conditioning, Pavlov paired the whistle with the food. Now, the food was already causing a response. So once he pairs that whistle with the food, the dog is going to be salivating. And eventually what we see in panel 4 is the dog is going to be salivating to the whistle. Not necessarily, you can see the food's not being presented anymore. So here, that neutral stimulus has now become a conditioned stimulus. And you can also see that the unconditioned response and conditioned response are the same response. The difference is that what's triggering them has changed. Initially, the food triggered the salivation response. Now it's the whistle triggering it. So we also have to talk about John Watson, and actually it's John B. Watson, and I always like to say, think of the B as standing for behaviorism. So he also conducted a very famous classical conditioning study with little Albert. When he would present little Albert with something furry, no response, but Albert would hear a loud bang. He'd get scared and startled from the bang. And while he was hearing that loud bang, he was presented with a white rat. So now anytime Albert sees anything white and fluffy, he feels scared. So using that scenario, try to label the unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, neutral stimulus, conditioned stimulus, and conditioned response. All right, so it looks like most people have got their little icons in place. So here we go. Okay, hopefully you got these correct. The unconditioned stimulus is that loud clang of the steel bar being hit with a hammer. So just think, if somebody suddenly clanged a steel bar with a hammer, your reaction would probably be the same, or it'd be a natural fear response. You'd be startled. The white rat, when it was first presented to Albert, had caused no reaction. It was a neutral stimulus. But when you pair that white rat with the clanging of that steel bar with the hammer, that white rat then becomes what Albert has associated with that clanging. And now it's the white rat making Albert feel afraid and fearful. You can see he's crying in the panel. So that's the conditioning that took place with Watson. He used the white rat and then paired it with that steel bar being hit with the hammer, and eventually got Albert to have a conditioned response of fear, even just to the rat, even when that sound wasn't being made. Obviously, one of the most unethical studies that we talk about in AP psychology, and one that routinely kind of upsets my students a bit, but we did really learn something important from it, because obviously Pavlov was working with dogs. Through Watson working with a human, we can see that humans can also be conditioned in much the same way. All right, so let's try another question. A cancer patient becomes nauseated following chemotherapy treatments. After a few treatments, the patient begins having a sick feeling whenever entering the treatment room. The treatment room has become. All right, fantastic. I can see that many of you were not fooled at all by this one. The correct answer is D. So let's briefly just walk through this study, okay? A cancer patient's nauseated following chemotherapy treatments. So if the cancer patient is becoming nauseous because of the chemotherapy, that's not something they've learned or they've been trained to do. It's a natural response. So in that situation, the chemotherapy treatment would be the unconditioned stimulus, and the nausea would be the unconditioned response. It's something happening completely naturally. But eventually, once the treatment room and the chemotherapy treatments have been associated for the patient, eventually just being in that room makes the patient feel nauseous. So the room itself shouldn't have any impact. It should be a neutral stimulus. But if that's the room where you're getting those chemotherapy treatments that make you so sick, eventually you're going to start to have that same response anytime you're in the room, which means the room has now become the conditioned stimulus. So a lot of you did very well on that. Excellent. All right, so now moving away from classical conditioning a little bit, moving toward operant conditioning, which means we start with a man named Edward Thorndike. Now, Edward Thorndike isn't necessarily one that some of you may be as familiar with as Pavlov or Watson or Skinner, but he was still very important in operant conditioning. So he proposed something called the law of effect. Basically, he believed that behaviors that were followed by a favorable or desirable outcome would be more likely to occur again, and behaviors that were followed by unfavorable or undesirable outcomes likely wouldn't be repeated. Okay, so you probably kind of already see where we're going with this, because this helped to form the basis of operant conditioning. All right, reinforcement and punishment are also important concepts in operant conditioning, and it's important to note that both reinforcement and punishment shape behavior. Okay, the difference is one of them increases the likelihood that a particular behavior will occur, and one decreases the likelihood that a particular behavior will occur. So take a moment and tell me which one of those would be reinforcement and which one would be punishment. All right, I wanted to give everybody a chance. I know it takes a minute to type, so I wanted to give everybody just a minute. But it looks like most of you are on the right track. So when we're talking about increasing the likelihood of a behavior, that's going to be a reinforced behavior. And then one that decreases the likelihood of a particular behavior is going to be a punished behavior. Great job. All right, so now we move from Thorndike to B.F. Skinner. Like I said, if you've already covered this unit with your teacher, then this is probably a name you're already familiar with. So B.F. Skinner was a big advocate for operant conditioning. He believed that behavior could be shaped, but he also believed that behavior was controlled by reinforcement, that it wasn't necessarily something that was controlled by your unconscious, that we actually controlled our behavior in response to environmental consequences. So in operant conditioning, we use fixed or varying forms of reward or punishment to elicit a desired behavior. And we just established on the last slide, if this is a behavior that we want to continue, like saying please and thank you, for example, then reinforcement would likely be used to make sure that that behavior continues. I always like to say that when we think of something that's reinforced, like reinforced concrete or reinforced steel, it's something that's made stronger. And that's what reinforcement is designed to do with a behavior. It's designed to make it stronger so it will continue. If we're talking about a behavior that you wouldn't want to continue, then that'd be a behavior that would likely be punished, with the idea that if what you're doing is getting punishment or an undesirable outcome, you're going to be less likely to continue doing that in the future. So let's try another question. Children who are consistently praised for receiving high grades in school will likely continue to work for high grades. Using an operant conditioning explanation of this phenomenon, which of the following is true? All right, fantastic. Looks like just about everybody selected the correct answer, which is letter A. So in this scenario, receiving high grades in school, I think anybody would agree this is a behavior that you and probably your parents would likely want to continue. So the best way to ensure that behavior is going to continue is to reinforce it. Now here it says the praise functions as a positive reinforcer. We haven't really talked about this just yet. We will, but just keep in mind for the purposes, especially in this lesson and in this unit, when we're talking about positive and negative, those don't mean good and bad here. Positive is going to mean something has been added. Negative means something has been taken away. So here, because the praise has been added in response to the behavior, the praise would be a positive reinforcement. So when we think about reinforcement, again, always encouraging behavior. That's what reinforcement is always designed to do. But it can be a positive reinforcement or a negative reinforcement. So if it's a positive reinforcement, that means you're going to further encourage this behavior to continue by offering a desirable stimulus, something we might think of as a reward. So in the previous example, the praise that the child received would be that positive or desirable stimulus, but it could also be, you know, money or candy or something like that, something that you want. Okay. Negative reinforcement is still encouraging a behavior, but it's doing it by taking away something undesirable. Now, this is also a good time to kind of point out a lot of students will confuse negative reinforcement and punishment. If you can really lock in, like kind of, you know, figure out a way to lock it into your brains that reinforcement, whether positive or negative, always encourages a behavior, and punishment, whether positive or negative, always discourages a behavior, that may make it a little bit easier for you to keep the two of those straight. Because a negative reinforcement, again, it's still encouraging a behavior, but it's doing it by taking away something aversive or unpleasant. So if I want my daughter to clean her room, I could stare at her and nag her and yell at her. All of those are going to be unpleasant things that she doesn't want to experience. So it's probably going to make her clean her room so that she can remove that unpleasant stimulus. Okay. When we're thinking about punishment, again, the emphasis is it discourages a behavior. If you're punishing a behavior, then it's likely a behavior that you don't want to continue. You want to grow weaker. So again, we see negative and positive punishment. Now, again, both are still discouraging behavior. But with negative punishment, we take away something desirable to discourage the behavior. Best example would be your parents taking away your cell phone for disrespect or whatever you've done wrong. Okay. Positive punishment would be still discouraging the behavior, but here you're adding something undesirable. Okay. So I can't imagine what you would do to make your parents give you an electric shock. Hopefully that's not on the table in your household. But it could also be a spanking or, you know, yelling at you for doing something wrong. One of my favorite stories I tell my students is when I was a little girl, I said a very naughty word to some of my friends in my neighborhood, and my parents washed my mouth out with Palmolive dish soap. And to this day, I can still remember what that Palmolive dish soap tasted like. So that was a positive punishment. They were trying to discourage me from saying ugly words by adding something really undesirable. Okay. So again, just try to figure out a way to keep those two very separate, what reinforcement does and what punishment does. And I think that will potentially help you keep from confusing negative reinforcement with punishment. Okay. All right, so when we are reinforcing a behavior, one of the big areas where B.F. Skinner worked was figuring out, you know, it may not be likely or feasible that we can reinforce a behavior every single time it happens. You know, if you're getting rewarded or reinforced for good grades, then those are probably good grades on your report card, but not necessarily good grades on every single assignment you make in every single class. That would get really tough on your parents, your teachers, and everybody else. So what usually happens is something called partial or intermittent reinforcement. And that just means exactly what it sounds like. We don't reinforce all the time, but we do get reinforced sometimes. Okay. There's two types of reinforcement schedules. We can have schedules that are based on a ratio, and that would be a ratio of the behavior to the reinforcement, like how many times we do something before we get the reinforcement. Or they can be based on interval. Well, a certain amount of time has to pass in order for you to get the reinforcement. Okay. So what you're seeing on this graph in front of you is that these schedules of reinforcement, again, they're all intermittent or partial. Okay. So with fixed ratio and variable ratio, again, these are based on how many times the behavior occurs. Okay. The behavior has to happen for the reinforcer to come. And you can see the reinforcer is that little black bar. So what I point out to my students when I'm teaching this in class is that these lines, you can see they move up very, very quickly. Okay, this is number of responses, and then this is the time that elapses. So you can see when these are being based on a ratio schedule, we typically pick up those behaviors pretty quickly. And if it's a fixed ratio, then that means we know exactly how many behaviors we have to complete to get the reinforcement. Like buy 5 coffees, get 1 free. Okay, so that leads to a really steady rate of responding because we predictably know when we can expect that reinforcement to occur. We know exactly how many behaviors we have to do. With variable ratio, anytime you see the word variable, that means changing or random. Here, we have no idea how many behaviors we may have to complete to get reinforced, but you can see there's not much difference in the rate of responding. The best example of variable ratio behaviors is gambling. People who play slot machines or play the lottery, for example, they have no way of knowing if they're going to hit a jackpot or if their lucky numbers are going to come in, and yet they seem to keep going. This behavior really seems to resist extinction, like people just continue to do it over and over and over. Okay. Now, when we look at these two lines, the red and the purple line, we're looking at interval-based schedules. So again, these are just based on an amount of time that goes by, not necessarily how many behaviors you have completed. So again, those little black bars still represent when the reinforcement is happening. So with fixed interval, you can see this kind of looks like a wave at the beach, because every time that reinforcement is coming, and it's on a fixed schedule, so you know when it's coming, there's like a peak in those responses. That's what you see. That peak meets with the reinforcer perfectly. So a good example of a fixed interval would be like a weekly paycheck. You know exactly what day you're going to be paid. There's no question about it. It's based on an increment of time, not necessarily an amount of behaviors. With variable interval, you really don't know how often that reward or reinforcement might be coming, but it still leads to a very steady rate of responding. You can see that line is straight, even though, again, we have no way of knowing at what time those reinforcers are coming, okay? So here are some schedules of reinforcement. Take a minute, look at these, and then see if you can identify which one is a fixed ratio, fixed interval, variable ratio, and variable interval schedule of reinforcement. And guys, if it helps with the typing, you're welcome to abbreviate fixed ratio, fixed interval. See a couple of people still typing, so I'm gonna give it one more minute. Okay. So take a look at the chart, and we're gonna just briefly talk through each one of these, okay? So you can see that the fixed element, meaning you know exactly either how many behaviors you have to complete or how long it's going to take to get it. So a fixed ratio behavior would be earning frequent flyer miles, because you know how many miles you have to earn to then earn a free flight. Getting a salary increase every year, since we can see that there's a time element there every year, this would be an interval schedule. But if we know it's happening every single year, that means it's a fixed interval. Now, on the other side of the chart, playing bingo, not necessarily the same thing as gambling, but it's also very random. You have no way of knowing if your numbers are going to be pulled out of the machine or not. So it would be variable ratio, because your number has to be pulled for you to get the reinforcement. You can't have a bingo if your numbers don't get drawn. Going fishing, however, would be variable interval, because you may sit out there all day long and catch nothing, but then you may be out there 10 minutes and catch 2 or 3 fish. You have no way of knowing, okay? All right, so let's move on to the memory portion of this review session. I realize for some of you, and I can certainly speak for myself, my students have finished with Unit 4, but we're really just starting with memory. So if there are some questions you're not sure about in this portion of the review session, still at least give them a try. You know, we're always going to go over the correct answers, because this is just designed to help you. So let's start with a multiple choice question. According to the information processing view of memory, the first stage in memory processing involves which one of these?
Yeah, that screen coming up is
Yeah, it looks like these answer choices aren't matching with the question, guys. So sorry about that.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and just look at the correct answer for this one. I apologize. We must be having a little technical glitch there. So in the information processing view of memory, and we're going to look at this in just a moment, but the very first stage would be encoding. Encoding is literally like getting the information in the first place, because you can't possibly move on to storage or retrieval if you haven't first seen or been exposed to the information, okay? All right, so here's our information processing model, and you can see it involves 3 processes: encoding, storage, and retrieval. So the encoding is literally the process of putting things into storage. And there's some information, you know, this kind of involves our attention as well, because there are some things that you're not going to really deem a priority or important enough to be put into storage in the first place, Okay. But if it is important information that you know you're going to need to see again, hopefully you encode it in a way that it can then be stored. And it may be stored in short-term memory or long-term memory, depending on the kind of information it is, and how much rehearsal is involved with it. But ideally, you have encoded the information and stored the information in a way that you can then later retrieve the information. And that would be the process of bringing the memory back to one's consciousness. So one of the examples that I like to use with my students is the national anthem. For most people, they learn the national anthem as a song, which means you encoded it or put it into storage as a song. So you've stored it as a song. So if someone asked you a random lyric or what's the fourth line in the national anthem, in order to retrieve it, you may have to actually sing it to be able to bring it back to your consciousness. Okay. All right, so when we're talking about encoding, we have to kind of stop and back up just a little bit, because again, before that information can ever be moved into storage, we have to be exposed to it in the first place. And this is where we encounter our sensory memory. And exactly what it sounds like, this is sensory information that we're exposed to, but it has to stand out or be prioritized to be selected to be processed further. So two examples of sensory memory involve iconic memory and echoic memory. So iconic memory is going to be what we see. And although it's not spelled the same way, when you say iconic, it sounds like I. So that might make it an easy way for you to remember it. So an iconic memory is going to be based on a visual stimulus, and it stays for just tenths of a second before it refreshes. In other words, it's very fast, very fleeting. Now, your echoic memory involves auditory stimuli. It typically lasts a little longer. You can see it stays for 3 to 4 seconds before it then refreshes. The problem with sensory memory is it can be difficult to measure. These are basically estimates because it refreshes so quickly, it makes it really difficult to actually measure how long it lasts, but it doesn't last long. So when we think about echoic memory, for example, I remember when I was a kid, if my mom was talking to me, and sometimes you zone out a little bit when your parents are telling you something, and she'd say, "You're not listening to me." And I'd say, "No, I am." And she'd say, "What's the last thing I just said?" And I could repeat back the last maybe 4 or 5 words she said. It really wasn't because I was listening and paying attention. It was because it was still hanging out there in my sensory memory. So like I said, it lasts just a few seconds, but it is fleeting. Okay. All right, so when we think about processing information to hopefully move it into storage, there are 2 types of processing. So although they're in a different order on the screen, I'm going to start with effortful processing because it's literally processing that requires our effort and our attention. Okay, so this is the encoding where you are processing information that you really want to hang on to. All right, one of the most common ways that we do that is through maintenance rehearsal. And it could be something as simple as just repeating the information in your consciousness. Now, that doesn't literally mean you're walking around saying acetylcholine, acetylcholine. But it could mean that every time you're looking at flashcards or note cards or quizzing yourself, you're rehearsing that material. In other words, the more often you see it and repeat it, the more likely it's going to be moved into storage. There's also elaborative rehearsal, and this means that we have rehearsal still, but it's much more deep and meaningful. So here we're processing information for meaning, which would be semantic processing, but we're doing it to more easily help us produce those long-term memories. So you could just be, rehearsing your flashcards. Not that that's not a great idea, but it's probably going to be easier for you to maintain the memory of what that word means if you come up with like real world examples to go along with those vocabulary words. We don't typically tend to hold on to words long term if we just process them in terms of their definition. We tend to hold on to words that we actively use and make meaning of, and maybe have ways of having real world or authentic examples to go along with them. Now, automatic processing is kind of what it sounds like. It's automatic and unconscious. In many instances, we end up with information in our long-term memory that we had no intention of putting there in the first place. For me, I told my students there was a commercial for Big Red Gum when I was a little kid that had a really memorable theme song. To this day, I remember that theme song, and I probably haven't seen that commercial in 30 years easily. So it was automatically processed. I didn't work to rehearse that information. I didn't put any effort into retaining it. It just kind of happened. So that does happen sometimes. We have this unconscious encoding of incidental information. It usually involves the elements of space, time, and frequency. For example, you may retrace your steps to remember where you laid your keys, and it's not that you worked to rehearse that memory, it just was unconsciously encoded. Or you may say, wow, that's the third green car I've passed in the last 5 minutes. Again, that's not something you've really worked to encode and store. It just automatically got encoded. Well-learned information is also an example of automatic processing, like word meanings, for example. I tell my students, when you're reading a book, you likely don't have a dictionary sitting right next to you so you can look up every single word you're reading, because over time, through the process of learning to read, you've also memorized what a lot of those words on the page mean, so you can put them together and form, meanings, not just the words, but the sentences themselves. And then parallel processing. An example of this could be reading backwards. I don't know about you, but I see those things from time to time where it'll have like letters out of order, or the words are backwards, and it says, if you can read this, whatever. If you're able to read it, that's also an example of automatic processing. Again, it's not something you have elaboratively or consciously worked to do, because who really cares if you can read words backwards? It's like a party trick if it's anything, but it's something that's automatically processed. It's not something that you would put any conscious effort into. So let's try this question. Memory for automatic activities such as bike riding and handwriting is known as which type of memory? And it looks like these answer choices still are not matching up, guys. I truly apologize for that. We will get these little kinks worked out. This is the first session this week, so my apologies.
Yeah.
So let's talk about these for a minute, and then we'll go ahead and actually look at the correct answer for the question. So when we're talking about memories and the types of memories that we form, we have memories that are like these automatic skill-based memories, bike riding and handwriting, for example. Once you learn how to do those activities and you learn how to do them well, it's not a situation where you need to talk yourself through it or like narrate the process of it. You remember it so well that it just becomes almost automatic. I tell my students, if you closed your eyes, you could still easily tie your shoes, because again, it's a well-learned skill. So those types of memories that are being referred to in this question would be procedural memories, which is letter B. Those are very different than the types of memories where, like I recalled having my mouth washed out with soap. That would be a declarative or explicit memory, because I can talk about it. I can literally tell you what happened. It's not a skill. It's not a procedure. It's literally like a little episode from my life that I can remember, and we all have those, but they are a different type of memory. So let's look at the different types of memories when we're looking at long-term memory. So on the left-hand side of this chart, you can see those declarative memories are also known as explicit memories. Okay, so these require more conscious effort. I like to say every time we sort of tell this memory or relate this memory, we're having to put effort into retrieving it and then restoring it. And sometimes we even restore it with additional details that weren't originally there, so they can change a little bit. But this can also be semantic memory. So knowing how language functions, understanding the correct order to put your words into to facilitate meaning, knowing general knowledge and facts, like George Washington was the first president of the United States. All of those would be semantic memories, because they're still long-term memories, and they're still memories that you can talk about, but they don't involve you personally or any particular event or personal experience from your life. They're information you've learned and you've retained, but they don't have any personal meaning for you. Okay. On the other side of the chart, we can see those procedural memories are known as implicit memories. So here, instead of knowing what, we know how. We know how to do something. So bike riding is a great example because it involves motor skills. People throw around the expression muscle memory. Although that's not really a thing, it does involve these implicit memories, because it's like your muscles automatically know what they need to do or how they need to engage for you to participate in this activity. If you know how to ride a bike, for example, you don't have to coach yourself through putting your hands on the handlebars or your feet on the pedals. You know what to do, and it feels very automatic. Okay, since we talked about learning earlier in this session, you'll also see under those implicit memories, operant conditioning and classical conditioning. So those conditioned associations in many instances also become very implicit and automatic, because in some cases, we may not even remember our first experience of having that conditioned association. One of the very first questions you looked at today was about the little boy who fell down at his grandmother's house. 10 years from now, he may still feel that fear and anxiety walking into his grandmother's house, but have no conscious memory of the falling down ever happening. He just has that feeling. So it's something that's automatic. It's not something that we've really put any effort into at all. It just seems to kind of be there. Okay, so motor skills, operant conditioning, classical conditioning, again, all of those would be implicit memories because they're more like procedural or skill and in some cases unconscious memories. All right, so when we think about the processes involved with memory, that encoding and storage, retrieval is obviously a really big one too, getting that information out. So the two types of retrieval are recall and recognition. All right, take a moment and respond to the question and say which is easier and why. I see some of you still typing, so I'm gonna give you just a couple more seconds. All right, it looks like most of you are definitely on the right track. You recognize that recognition is a lot easier. And the reason why is because, as some of you indicated, you can see all your options and you're literally just recognizing the correct answer. You have those cues to sort of jog your memory. Whereas with recall, you have to retrieve information that was learned earlier. You may have some cues. There is cued recall. So in an FRQ, for example, you have those concepts listed there that you need to discuss. Those might serve as sort of cues to aid in your recall, but it's not going to be nearly as easy as if you saw those in the context of a multiple choice question. And I like to tell my students, with any multiple choice question, even if you have no idea what the answer is, you already have a 20% chance of getting it correct. And that's because of that recognition. One of the answer choices that's listed there has to be the correct one. With recall, you're kind of on your own. You have to just be able to retrieve that information. All right, so let's try this question. In memory experiments on free recall, the recency effect refers specifically to which one? And we do have the correct answer choices for the question this time.
That was weird.
All right, fantastic. So it looked like most of you jumped right on answer B, and that was the correct answer. So when we're talking about the primacy and recency effect, think of it as items in a list. The example that I used with my students is the presidents. Everybody knows who the first president was, and I would be willing to bet most people know who the current president is because it's the first one and the last one in the list. But the ones in the middle, maybe except for Abraham Lincoln, they tend to get a little bit foggy, okay? So it's likely because of that primacy and recency effect. When we're looking at information in a list, we have a much easier time remembering what's at the very beginning and what's at the very end. All right. So when we think about memory, obviously there have been many studies conducted. One of the most famous people in memory experiments is Hermann Ebbinghaus. So what Ebbinghaus figured out is that overlearning actually increased retention. In other words, the more rehearsal of information he did on day one, the less rehearsal it took to learn the syllables, and these were like nonsense syllables, on day two. So he created what he called this idea of the spacing effect. So for those of you who think it's okay to cram the night before a test, this research completely flies in the face of that, because what Ebbinghaus's work showed is that studying over a long period of time actually produces better long-term retention than if you tried to cram it or mass it all in at once. So the big takeaway there is that spaced out studying beats cramming every time. And then that serial position effect is what we were just talking about. You have the primacy effect and the recency effect, where we have a tendency to recall better the first and last items in a list. All right, so now that we have looked at several multiple choice questions, let's try some free response practice. First, let's look at some general rules for writing FRQs, and these are always going to be the same, but it's always good to take a look at them again. First, your answers need to be cogent enough for the meaning to come through. That just means try to be as clear as possible. It's not up to the reader to try to assume what you meant or figure out where you were going with it. It has to come through clearly. Now, the good news is grammar and spelling won't typically count against you as long as they're close enough that the reader can be pretty sure of what you meant. Number two, you can only earn points if you clearly convey which part of the question you're answering. If you try to go out of order, and you can, but if you do, remember, it is completely up to you to make sure that the reader is clear. If you're answering letter D first, that you clearly indicate you're answering letter D, include the term. That way there's no possibility of them not being sure which part of the question you're answering. You have to apply the concepts to the prompt that you're given. Just a definition alone is not going to be enough to earn the point, but also make sure you are applying the concept to the prompt you were given. Don't go rogue and come up with some other example. Even if you feel it's a better example, that's not going to be enough to earn the point. Okay. Always make sure that you are not contradicting yourself. That doesn't commonly happen. But just keep in mind, you can't just kind of throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. For example, if you were asked to identify identify the independent variable, you couldn't identify both the independent and dependent and get credit. Okay, you could be contradicting yourself. So just make sure that you're not doing that. All right. So here is your question. I'm going to take just a minute and read over the prompt with you, and then I'm going to allow you a few minutes to start answering this. Dr. Jones was doing a formal research study of the effect of mental imagery on memory. She randomly assigned students in the psychology course she was teaching into two groups and required them to complete the task as part of their coursework. 40 students were in each group. Each group was presented the same list of 30 word pairs. For example, tree, book, house, street, friend, cat. Group A was told to form a mental image for each pair. Group B was not given that instruction. Each group was given 2 minutes to memorize the pairs of words. Dr. Jones then tested their recall of the list by giving each group the first word and asking them to remember the second word. Dr. Jones recorded the number of words recalled by each group and then debriefed the participants. The results are in this table below. Please take a moment, make sure that you're looking at those task verbs so that you're answering what you're actually being asked to answer, okay? All right, this is a full FRQ. You can see there are 7 bullet points there. So Ms. Mormon and I are going to be quiet for a little bit, give you some time to write and really think this through, and we'll be giving you feedback on your responses before we all come back together. We still have a few more minutes left on this FRQ. So remember, if you want to add anything to your response, you still have time to do so, okay? We'll still have time to go over each point. So let's take about 5 more minutes. All right, guys, it looks like most of you have had an opportunity to finish typing up your responses, and Ms. Mormon and I have been working to try to give as many of you feedback as possible. So let's go ahead and look at the scoring guidelines for this question. A couple things that I want to make mention of first. Please always make sure that you are paying attention to those task verbs. So there's a big difference between identify and explain. So with those first two, you're asked to identify the independent variable and then identify the control group. So just a brief statement is enough to earn the point for those, assuming that you're correctly identifying it. You don't really need to elaborate on it. But for those last 5, if you're being asked to explain, please make sure that you are. That's not just a simple identification or statement. You need to actually dig in and explain to make your meaning clear. So just make sure that you're always paying attention to those task verbs, because they'll generally give you a better understanding of how you need to respond. All right, so let's take a look at point 1. Point 1 asked for the independent variable. And as many of you correctly identified, the independent variable, or what was different between the two groups, was that group A was told to form a mental image for each pair. So that would be your independent variable. That use of mental imagery or the instruction to use mental imagery would be fine. So some examples of correct responses could have included: the independent variable is the students being told to form a mental image, or the independent variable is mental imagery. I saw several people who indicated the independent variable were the instructions given to the students. That would not be specific enough, because you need to clearly indicate what instruction they were given. So always make sure that you're giving enough information that it's absolutely clear to the reader what you mean. All right, let's look at point 2. So it looked like most of you were not fooled at all on this one. If group A was told to use a mental image for each pair, they would be the experimental group, making group B the control group, because if they weren't given any instruction, then they're the group that's just there for comparison. Okay, so the response had to indicate that the group that did not receive the instructions or the independent variable was group B. So some examples of correct responses, and remember, this was just the task verb was identify, so this could have been done very quickly. The control group is the group not being told to form a mental image, or as many of you said, the control group is group B, and that alone would be enough to score the point. Okay. All right, let's look at point 3. So I did see a little confusion in places on this one when it asked for research design. Just keep in mind, when it's asking for research design, it's literally being asked how the study was designed. What were the components of the design? Okay, so for this point to be earned, and remember this task verb was explain, the response had to indicate that the design was appropriate because it was an experiment, and that the design was appropriate because it was trying to show cause and effect. So here you could have simply earned the point by indicating that the research design was experimental, and that was being done so that the researcher could show cause and effect. That would have been enough to explain how it met those components. So some examples of correct responses: the only research design that shows a cause and effect relationship is an experiment, so that is why the researcher chose this. Very clear. It indicates that it's an experiment, and it also indicates that an experiment is what would show cause and effect, so it earns the point. This design uses the experimental method because you can manipulate one variable, and they even indicated specifically type of instruction to affect another, remembering the words. So here it's clearly explaining why it was an experimental method by actually using the variables that were present in the design itself. All right, point 4 asked about standard deviation. It seemed like this was a really tricky one for many of you. I noticed several of you who identified what a standard deviation is, so you provided a definition. But remember, number 1, definitions alone are not going to score the point. And here you were being asked to explain what the standard deviation indicated about the two groups. So the response had to meet one of the following criteria. It either had to indicate that the scores in group B were more varied or spread out than the scores in group A, or it could have indicated that the scores in group A were less varied than the scores in group B. Either way would have earned the point. So some correct responses could have said the standard deviation from group B is higher than in group A, so the scores in group B were more different from each other than those in group A. And that would have been enough to score, because you're indicating there's a wider spread or standard deviation in those group B scores than there are in group A. Or you could have just said group A had scores that were more similar to each other than group B. Now, one thing I do want to point out in that second response specifically, notice that the words standard deviation aren't actually used. Now, I don't often recommend that unless you are very, very sure that you know what the word is and that you can explain it. In most circumstances, I would always recommend using the term, but because this student clearly explained how the standard or what the standard deviation indicated, and then clearly referenced both groups, it still earned the point. Okay, so just like I said, kind of file that away as a little tip. If you aren't going to use the actual concept in your response, make sure that you're still giving enough clear information that you're still answering whatever that bullet point was. All right, point 5 asked about the ethical flaw. Many of you zeroed right in on this. So obviously, one big ethical red flag is you can never require anyone to participate in any kind of research. It has to be voluntary consent. So the response had to indicate that the researcher required the students to participate. And there were a variety of ways that you could have indicated that. Some examples could have said participation should be voluntary, or the researcher failed to obtain informed consent. I also saw people who indicated that the researcher required them to complete it as part of their coursework, or that their grade depended on their involvement. And there's still enough there that you're indicating requirement, and that's an ethical flaw. So like I said, there were several ways that you could have earned that point, as long as you were really targeting why that would be unethical. All right, for point 6, this was talking about the primacy effect. So many of you also did really well on this point, because the response had to indicate that if the primacy effect took place, students would remember more words they heard at the beginning of the list rather than at other parts of the list. So an example of a correct response could say, if students remember more words at the beginning of the list, then they have demonstrated the primacy effect. I even saw some responses that made specific reference to some of the words that were in those pairs, like tree or cat. One little piece on that though, if you are specifically asked about the primacy effect, just make sure you're being asked specifically about those first words in the list, not the last words, okay? If this had said serial position effect, you could have gone either way with it. But again, just make sure you're really targeting what that specific concept is that you're being asked about, because since this one specifically asked about primacy effect, it would only be appropriate to discuss those first terms in the list. All right, for point 7, levels of processing. So when we're talking about levels of processing, obviously we're talking about, is this a deeper level of processing or a more shallow level of processing? So the response had to meet one of the following criteria. It had to indicate that students who did better in group A used deep processing, or that students who did worse in group B used shallow processing. So either way would have worked there. And the response had to correctly relate that mental imagery to deep processing, because if you're conjuring up a mental image to go along with words, that would be a deeper level of processing. Now, some examples of incorrect responses. Students used mental imagery, which allowed them to process the words deeply. I'm sorry, guys, that should be correct responses. Students used mental imagery, which allowed them to process the words deeply. So again, having that added component of a mental image to go along with the word is a deeper, more meaningful way of processing. Or the students who had no instructions did worse because they used shallow processing. So in both of those little snippets of correct responses, you can see each one of them meets that criteria that was listed above, because it's relating the mental imagery to deep processing, or the lack of mental imagery to shallow processing, okay? All right, and based on what I saw in those FRQs, it looks like a lot of you had many of these concepts pretty clear. A good kind of frame of reference with FRQs, they're standard 7 points now. Both FRQs are 7 points. So if you can just like beat the mean, you know, if you got 4 or 5 out of 7, for right now especially, that's a really great target to be shooting for, especially since so many of you indicated this is still relatively new information. All right, so you had this same question at the very beginning of the presentation. Hopefully it's moved a little bit after going through this review session. I'm definitely seeing a lot more very confidence than I did at the beginning. So that's wonderful. Obviously, that's these review sessions. We kind of want that needle to move a little bit. So If this is still really new information, and I know for some of you, maybe you just haven't gotten to this point in your class yet. If nothing else, this is, a good way to preview the information and already kind of have some foundational elements there. So hopefully you got something out of this. And now is your chance to let us know how we did. Ms. Mormon is going to put the link to this Google form in the chat box as well. But this Google form is just to give us some feedback about how we did. Obviously, we had a couple of technical glitches there with some incorrect responses showing up. So I sincerely apologize for that. But hopefully we were able to keep it moving and not cause too much confusion there. But any feedback you give us is just going to help us make these sessions even better so that they can be a benefit to you. Okay. All right, guys. Have a great evening. Please remember the next session, even if you don't want to attend, you could make sure your friends know the next session will be Thursday night at 7 o'clock on the same material. Have a great night.